Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Denise Osier, and I am the Adult Programming Manager for the Gwinnett County Public Library. Tonight, we will be discussing the book, Sisterly Networks, 50 Years of Southern Women's Histories, edited by Catherine Clinton. And our author has some tremendous books on Harriet Tubman, Mrs. Lincoln, and women in the Civil War period. So I suggest that you not only buy this book, but take a look at her other books. Tonight's bookstore partner is Eagle Eye Bookshop, and they have brought in copies of the book, and they have signed book plates that they will put in those. So that's the only place that I know of that you can get a signed copy of the book we're going to talk about tonight, or some of Catherine's other books. To receive our monthly email that will tell you all about our programming, from cooking shows to gardening shows, immigration programs, authors, writers' workshops, simply email events@gwinnettpl.org. And I will type that into the chat box, so there's no need to write it down. Tonight's moderator is a very good friend of mine and a terrific lady. I am honored to be able to work with her. We met each other when she became the interim executive director of the AJC Decatur Book Festival. And she just fine-tuned that festival and ran it. It ran like a clock. And I had been with them for the entire 10 years of its existence, working as its retail bookstore coordinator. But under Joy Pope, it absolutely flourished. And she made lemonade out of lemons last year and created a wonderful virtual authors series that had hundreds and hundreds of guests. So I am very proud and pleased to introduce you now to Joy Pope.
Thank you so much, Denise. I love you. You're just wonderful. I had the pleasure of speaking with Catherine the other day after I read this book, and I'm going to give you some biographical information about her first, but I wanted to tell you that I looked through our records, and Catherine, you were at the very first Decatur Book Festival in 2006. And one of your historian colleagues was Erskine Clark, who is mentioned in the book. I thought that was kind of wonderful. There was a great lineup then, Natasha Trethewey and Carmen Agradidi, and I'm sure it was a wonderful experience. So Catherine has edited this wonderful book about Southern women's history, and I loved reading it. I was telling Catherine the other day that I'm a Southerner from Georgia and Alabama on my father and mother's side, and I have always been looking for more information about the South, and this book gives the reader not only some perspective about historians who are researching and doing scholarship on women historians in the South, but there's a long, wonderful list of other books to read. And I wish we were having a festival this year and I could just make a beautiful panel out of all of this, because as a Southerner, it is truly, genuinely so fascinating for me to see these titles. It's just gorgeous. But let me tell you a little bit about our guest. Catherine Clinton holds the Denman Chair of American History at the University of Texas at San Antonio and is the Professor Emerita at Queen's University, Belfast. She served on the Executive Council of the Society of American Historians and the Advisory Committee of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Bicentennial Commission, and she remains on advisory boards for Civil War History, Civil War Times, the President's Cottage and Soldiers Home, and Ford's Theater. Even just that is so interesting. Clinton has written and edited over 30 books, from children's fiction about Phyllis Wheatley to the Columbia Guide to American Women in the 19th Century, from booklets for the National Park Service to poetry anthologies. Her first book, The Plantation Mistress, Woman's World in the Old South, see what I mean, appeared in 1982 and was a selection of the History Book Club. Her 2004 biography of Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom, was named as one of the best nonfiction books by the Christian Science Monitor and the Chicago Tribune. Mrs. Lincoln, A Life was published by HarperCollins in 2009, And Clinton subsequently served as a consultant for Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln, which was wonderful. In 2016, Louisiana State University published her Fleming Lectures, Stepdaughters of History, Southern Women and the Civil War. Notably, she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in U.S. History, also in 2016. In November of 2016, she served as president of the Southern Historical Association. Her public presidential address, The Southern Social Network, inspired the Cassandra Project, a nonprofit educational initiative to combat sexual harassment within departments of history at Southern postgrad institutions. The first book in her new University of Georgia Press series, History in the Headlines, was published in 2019, Confederate Statues and Memorialization. And I believe there's another one in that series that you can tell us about. So first, let me just give Catherine a minute to tell you about this wonderful book that she has put together. And then I've got some questions for her.
Thank you so much, Joy. It's been really a joy to learn about your project of trying to keep that wonderful book festival going. I didn't know I was there in the first one, but how wonderful to be reminded, and that Erskine was there, and I had written a book on Fanny Kemble, and he followed up in his wonderful work, which I do talk about, as you point out in the book. So it is a big network of Southern historians working on Southern families, on Southern women, on the roles of changing our perception and views. You spoke quite warmly to me about the role of mythology and the way in which in the 21st century we're overturning some of the myths, and we're also looking into the root origin of many legends around Southern womanhood. It's not monolithic. It's not just one group. We try in our scholarship to be as diverse and broad as possible. And I served in the 1990s for a year as president of the Southern Association for Women Historians. In 2020, we had our 50th anniversary. We didn't get the big celebration that we had hoped for, but we did put together a book that tried to look back on the changes within the academy and within the field of popular history, and how and in what way scholarship had affected a change. So I went to some of my friends in the organization, some who were past presidents, others past secretaries, some future presidents, and asked them if we might come together and have a conference, which we did at the University of Florida in 2018. And out of that came these essays that, in a sense, capture essential elements of changes in our views of Southern women, and indeed Southern women's history. We also added a feature, a roundtable of both the featured speakers, but also some others who came along, because we wanted the voices of younger scholars. We wanted the voices of those who'd come from far to talk about the earliest days of the Southern Association for Women Historians. So it was a really wonderful moment of looking backward, but also looking forward. In what ways does our organization need to grow and change? And it happened in the fall of 2018 that we were discussing the need for looking at questions of race and expanding these issues. It's no surprise. And certainly as we look to three years later, this is one of the robust discussions that's going on in the field of history, popular literature, publishing, academe. And so the Southern Association for Women Historians, I argue, was there first. There was no ability to ignore the questions of race and class that were so central to Southern history. And asking very distinguished scholars to comment on this and give us their views was a really bracing, wonderful experience. We didn't ask people to follow a particular agenda, but imagine you were trying to tell a friend about the changes in the field. There are, of course, a few inside baseball moments where those of us who've been involved in Civil War history may try to code some of our analysis of changes that have gone on in this particularly challenging field, where it was a battleground when women began to integrate the role of women in the 1970s and 80s. But I can say now it's one of the most exciting fields, and it's captured in an essay by my good friend and collaborator, Michelle Gillespie, who is Dean of the Faculty at Wake Forest. And she was happy to look back on these changes and write and comment on the way in which putting real women into the stories that are generally decorated with the fictional women of Gone with the Wind is a really important part. But on that, maybe I'll just say I'm happy to comment on more. But this book is really written for a wider audience, and we're very pleased the University of Florida has made it wonderful. And you might say, well, people often ask me, what's your favorite book? And I was so glad for a long time I could say my next one, and that was this one. But also I begged them for a hot pink cover, and that's what they did do to give me that. So it is a joyful celebration of 50 years of coming together. And the men, as well as the women of the organization, have turned it into an annual celebration of all things in terms of the Southern Social Network.
So as I was saying the other day and a little bit today, this is very personal for me. So I was in elementary school in the 70s in Georgia, in Cobb County. Tell me a little bit about the 50 years. Like what was the 51st year? What was different about it than now? And I'm just curious because I want to have perspective on what kind of education I wasn't getting.
Well, let's remember that certainly in the 1970s, you were about 10 years out from the centenary of the American Civil War. And it's interesting that the centenary went on the rocks when many of the commissions were challenged because they didn't want to have integrated groups dealing with the Civil War. And eventually there was a lot of Sturm und Drang, but eventually people looked at the fact that we were going to have to expand our definitions of war beyond the battlefield to look at the home front, which was very key to many people, especially in the South. And we were going to have to look at the experience of emancipation, as well as the experience of surrender. So I think during the 25 years following the centenary, we had a very vigorous reinvestigation of the issues of the Civil War. And I know that by the 1990s, my collaborator, Nina Silber, and I did a book called Divided Houses, which had 18 essays by new young scholars looking at this question of what was the impact of the Civil War in a variety of ways that perhaps scholars hadn't thought about. Simultaneously, I see back on your shelf, I spy the work of Jackie Dowd Hall, a very revered mentor and prize-winning scholar. And her work really also made us look very differently at the issue of civil rights. And here we are looking at the civil rights movement, which was going on when you were in school. And how would that be interpreted? And indeed, trying to incorporate women and make sure their voices get included in a movement that was primarily featuring male leadership. But of course, I think the blood, sweat, and tears of boycotts and of sit-ins were often shared by women, in some cases disproportionately, the mimeographing and the spreading of the word. So when we look back at these experiences, integrating women is important. People working all across the South would want to bring that to the fore. And we do it often with the Southern Association for Women Historians meetings. We have meetings every 3 years, conferences where people come together, share their scholarship. And in that way, we can find out, oh, look what was going on in Gainesville, Florida. Oh, look at what was going on in Savannah, Georgia. There was a movement there that we need to capture and think about. So it's exciting to see that this scholarship can really change itself and make its way into the textbooks. And the textbooks are where most American children get their history. And it's a concerted effort on the part of scholars to make sure that these textbooks reflect the diverse views of many different American groups. When I was a young professor at Harvard, I remember one of my most admired scholars was a woman named Mary Beth Norton, and she did the first American history textbook with a woman lead author. And that was coming out in the 1980s. And you began to slowly change and transform and indeed have a diversity of voices to change our monolithic or monotonic American history. Southerners love good stories, tell good stories, share good stories, whether the authors are Black or white. The notoriety of the Southern storyteller is so important, and getting those stories into our books, I think, has been a real revolution. Certainly in slavery studies, in civil rights studies. Think of all the work that's been done.
Yeah, when all of you get this book, you're just going to be so impressed by the titles of the books that these scholars are writing. It's all just so interesting. And like you said, the history goes in textbooks. And then when you're no longer in school, you don't really continue. And that's been surprising to me to find. I'm a big reader. I've been reading for a long time, but it's surprising to me that this happens to be the one area. I mean, I know more about ancient Greece than I do about Georgia. And
well,
I
there's
was
great Georgia
reading
history out there for you, Joy. We'll have to give you a list. But I
was
think
reading the titles and I was just thinking, good Lord, this is all just so wonderful. And so in 50 years, not only has the perspective changed and the narrative is changing, but you guys had to fight it. Talk to me a little bit about what you said the other day. Describe what you meant by the ethic of sharing. Like how did it happen?
Yes, well, I think that most of us went to graduate school during a boom time and we were getting our degrees. Again, thank you for mentioning my presidential address in 2016, when I addressed the question of sexual harassment. And our project is going to look into the fact that we feel there were many people left by the wayside. The academy opened up to women scholars, but did the actual departments open up? Was there a warmth and embrace of the women scholars coming in that was not predatory? So we were looking at this question and trying to comment on it. And so, we also wanted to think about the way in which exchanging information was so important during this time. So it was a group of women who came together at the Southern Historical Association. First, they were a caucus, and then they decided that they needed an organization. And at the very first meeting of the Southern Association of Women Historians, because we changed our name to FOR. You could be for or against, and we like people for, but we don't want to make it only a single sex institution. But the very first meeting, the only meeting room that the great Southern Historical Association could provide to these women leaders was in a boiler room in the basement of the Golf House in Louisville. And so, like the great women that came before them, they were undaunted by this, and they formed a group, and they began a newsletter, and they began mimeographing and planning meetings. And before you knew it, excuse me, our organization has an annual address at the Southern Historical Association, and we had to book a bigger and bigger room because we were competing with the presidential address. Why? Because people wanted to see the latest news, see their friends, and exchange ideas. And we found, really, among the graduate students especially, and the younger scholars, having the opportunity to share their work, but also their experiences, was so very important. So in our volume, we don't just deal with purely academic matters. We deal with matters of community and sisterhood. Melissa Walker, who served as a secretary of the organization, later a president. She's been president, of course, of the Agricultural History Association. She taught at a women's college, Converse, in South Carolina for many years. And she writes about the ethic of sharing that came out of our organization. Instead of having a pedestal and you put the primary scholar on top, and then everyone would come around and rattle and shake in order to knock someone off and be replacing the him of the top of the heap, we found it really better to try and have an organization that was much more looking into ways of creating a sense of community, a sense of collaboration. I make the point that we have published some of our presidential addresses in previous volumes and previous series, and our presidential addresses are not given by the president, but rather the president selects a friend, a colleague, a valued sister or brother in the community who they want to share with the wider SAWH community. So it really, I think, has worked to our great advantage that whoever is president gets to come and have a great party and meet with other people and have their friends' scholarship move forward. And when I look at these incredible addresses, which are all listed at the back of this book, you can almost see the way in which history has developed and gone, that it was 12 to 13 years ago when Jane Daly was president. She asked her friend Heather Thompson to come and talk about the carceral state. And Heather later published her book, Blood in the Water, which won the Pulitzer Prize. So we're very pleased that our community of scholars has produced great scholarship through this ethic of supporting one another in the early stages and featuring one another. And it really has created, I think, quite a buoyant community. So many scholars from Yankee institutions, Western institutions, come to the Southern meeting, which happens annually in person, and we hope to re-meet in person the second weekend in November in New Orleans. And aren't we lucky to have this meeting scheduled in New Orleans, which I know will be a wonderful place for us to gather, meet old friends, make new networks, and gin out a lot more of the exciting work that we need to be reading about, because the hunger for history has become quite extreme. Look at the historic times we're living through. Look at the issues we need to grapple with.
Yeah, for sure. We've got to get you back, you and your colleagues, to the book festival, because I want to participate too. I'm kind of jealous. Okay, well, that goes into my question, like, where
we
can
come
the
to Atlanta once in a while too, I tell you, and we have a great party when we're in Atlanta, I can do that.
Where can the lay person go for this, to experience this scholarship?
Well, I do say that I think there is a great network of women's organizations promoting in the 1920s and 30s, women in New England who were stuck at institutions which weren't supporting them as much as they would like, created the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, and that met every 3 years. And then this other Association for Women Historians decided that we didn't have enough traction at the Berkshire Conference, and we wanted to start our own. So every 3 years, there is a triennial conference that people can come to. And I'm very pleased that I believe the revolution in this scholarship can be directly attributed not just to faculty members, not just to teachers at institutions, but also to the great teachers in libraries. So my opening chapter is about librarians and archivists. And I tell the story of being a young scholar, going out looking for women, being discouraged, then re-engaging when I had these wonderful archivists hand me these wonderful materials that they were looking for. And indeed, over the years, the public library has been a place where I have been through humanities councils, through book fairs such as yours, through public outreach program for authors. I have found that many of the people want to re-engage with history, and going to author talks can get people excited about this. If you want to see the broader issues of scholarship, a professional conference is a good place to start. But even some of my colleagues don't like going to the American Historical Association because they find it's huge and scary. Although the first one to meet in person in 2 years will be, yes, again, in New Orleans in January, when my great friend Jacqueline Jones will be president. She served for many years as chair of the department at the University of Texas in Austin. She's a prolific author and a great comrade. And at these organizations, they do have registration for non scholars for non-affiliated faculty. They have teachers who come in and say, I want to try and get some exciting ideas into my classroom. So we have outreach programs for teachers, which the AHA is spearheading. As a matter of fact, the meeting I'm going to in January in New Orleans is where I'm going to talk about the children's books that I've written, because I believe getting good history to trickle down into what is called juvenile literature, although it's young reader literature, but also even into the picture books, even into, I worked on a textbook series for children, a social studies series, and we did biographies for kindergartners, because I really believe the story of a life is so inspirational, so important. And when I started out as an author, I thought this was important, but when I became a freelance writer, unaffiliated with any university for 15 years, which was my choice to raise my children. And during that period, I became quite alarmed because I did not see enough integration and diversity in children's literature. This was in the 1980s. Look at it now.
Yeah.
Look at it flourish. And really, librarians have been such an important part of this outreach and this dynamic new field.
You know, it's so true. Librarians are still doing it, like we're seeing tonight. Definitely over the last year, libraries have started doing this. And it's such a library thing to do. It's so important and so community-based and so just lovely. I'm excited to see what else might happen. Like maybe this world that I'm perceiving in your work as maybe that I thought was closed to me, maybe will feel more open.
No, I remember going to a library visit that was organized through a humanities grant, and there was an exhibit from the Gilder Lehrman Institute, who I've done a lot of work for, and they've created wonderful story panels that can travel. And not now, of course, but they have in the past. And then scholars can come in and talk. One of my favorite lessons, which I always tell younger scholars, is I'm always trying to explain that I once got back a very critical, very, very harsh reader's report from a press, which said that Professor Clinton couldn't even get her facts straight because I was talking about someone in the year 1861. And in one place I said she was 15, and in another place I said she was 16. And of course she'd had a birthday.
Oh,
that was the point. And I said, well, I can pretty much judge that perhaps it was a non-parent or someone who didn't like their birthday that was doing that. But I tell the story, I was in this county library, and I was there and I was talking about a book, and I was trying to talk about Harriet Tubman, and that Harriet Tubman might not have in her head her age, because we all go kind of fuzzy. But if you ask someone, you know, what year were you born in, that's, you know, that can often stick. That pops into your head more than how old are you. But I was trying it in the audience, and I said to a woman sitting on the front row, I said, "Excuse me, madam, but how old are you?" And of course she said, "None of your damn business." And I thought that was so wonderful. And again, it taught me a great lesson that in a Southern audience, you don't ask a lady her age. And I thought, you know, it probably could have happened in New England as well, but it did say that the Southern audiences are wonderful, but you better not cross certain lines. And again, as a young author being out and going to libraries, I learned so much from the questions from the audience. So I'm looking forward to some tonight, I hope. But I would say that also the Southern experience of African-American women has been really featured and emphasized in the 20th century and in the early 19th century. The enslaved women's experience, we have a lot of literature, a lot of bounty looking at this. We also have a lot about the women activists of the civil rights movement, and certainly look at the fact that someone, you know, someone can start out and her boycott, her image is shown all over the world, so that Rosa Parks is an international name from a small movement in Alabama. And I think, you know, these kind of things are great. But in our book, we invited a great scholar, Sharice Jones Branch, to reflect on what about the great majority of Black Southern women who were living in rural areas, who were
Right.
forming communities and societies and clubs and groups, and this nurtured them. And she tells marvelous stories about doing oral history and how you work your way into a community through storytelling, but also story listening. And I think, so the book can give great insight into how and in what way historians gather information, how and in what way historians try and reshape our perception, perhaps, of
Yeah,
what
her,
the
her
lived
essay was
experience.
particularly helpful to and moving to me. I can't wait to read her work.
Right,
Last year, our book festival celebrated African American literature, but we had a culinary lineup that celebrated African American culinary history. And
wow,
I was doing some research, and I learned, for instance, that of course, I mean, I feel stupid that I had to learn this, but that the Low Country in South Carolina is good for rice because it matches West Africa, and there are 150 versions of West African rice that are available. And that's just one of the examples of how much history just explodes your mind once you start getting involved in it. So
right.
the book is just so good about that.
And don't we
Okay.
love to get involved in Southern history through culinary matters?
Oh yeah.
Ole Miss has a wonderful food festival where they look at Southern foodways, and that's always been a favorite festival to go to Oxford. And they have wonderful books, a university, great libraries. So all over the South, I tell people that once, we're going to get on the road again. Every magazine I see, everyone is featuring the road, and I love the road. I lived in Northern Ireland for 10 years, but I remember once just landing in Newark and getting in my car and going down to Charleston, going to Atlanta, making my way to Mobile for a meeting, and eating my way through the South. I might
Right.
but
right.
I think
the audience member for a recipe, maybe. Okay.
but there also is, a hunger for history, and there's a new kind of history. I was just over in Louisiana where I'm trying to get some internships set up for some of my students, and the River Road plantations are really a fantastic resource, but Whitney Plantation, which looks at the lives of the enslaved and really tries to turn the whole plantation tour inside out, that we're going to look at the inside, we're going to look behind the big house, we're going to get the lives of the majority of people. And I think this is really going on in sites all across the South and is very exciting.
Yeah, it is. I can't wait to get, like you said, get in the car. Okay, so here's a question. Well, there are several. One is, what's the next book for you? But let me ask this second one first. A COVID question. As a writer, did you find the isolation helpful for your writing since we had so much time that we could not travel or get out of the house? That's a great question. What's COVID been like for your
question? And I find I just talk to all my friends, and it's a thumbs up or thumbs down on how COVID has affected them. Because I found some people finished their books earlier than they projected or ever expected. Those of us, especially at public institutions, were thrown into real disarray in March of 2020, having to completely switch gears, keep our programs going, keep our student spirits up while they were losing aunts, uncles, family members. I teach at a Hispanic serving institution. 50% of my students are the first members of their family to go to college. 50% of my students are Latinx. So we really had to, in a way, create a buoyancy that this is a part of history. Let's look back on other pandemics. Let's look back on other issues and incorporate that into your scholars now, your researchers. We just gave awards today in our university to students who were doing great work. It was, to me, an opportunity for me to say, wait, I've written 30 books, and the world is not waiting for the next Catherine Clinton volume. An editor maybe, but the world can hold on. And I also feel that I was writing on a topic that was really personal and important to me. I'd won a Guggenheim Fellowship to work on it. It was very ironic because when I embarked on this topic, my next topic is going to be the impact of the Civil War on diagnoses of insanity. And even more importantly, how did soldiers deal with mental disorders and the after effects of the Civil War? And I'm only focusing on northern soldiers, mainly white male soldiers. So the deep irony for me is that I spent my whole career not working on white men in the North. And now here I was focusing on them. I could tell my mentor, James McPherson, that I finally discovered the white men in the Civil War. And I was happy to do that. But the archives are mainly in Washington, D.C. I'm working in St. Elizabeth's Hospital. I had an entire agenda that was thrown sideways by COVID. So what I have done is to try and devote myself to the kind of projects like, getting this book off the ground, getting this book going, trying to think of the kinds of conferences and networks. And we have online book clubs where we discuss new books coming out. Why? Because there aren't as many wonderful outlets like yours, Joy, for the younger scholars to get on the circuit, to get their work out. So I find about half my friends have really slumped in terms of the scholarship. My darling friends in European history, in Latin American history, are simply cut off from their archival resources. The digitization project has not been kind to them as it has been to many of us in American history.
Interesting. Just for clarity, the next book that you're going to publish, the next one, the one you're working on right now, is about the mental illness?
Yes, I won an award for a project called Diagnosing Insanity, Soldiers and the Civil War. As I got into it, I did a lot of work and I wrote 6 or 8 chapters. And then my editor that I was working with said, what is this book? Why are you talking about doctors and institutions, and he made me turn it inside out. So now I'm looking at the lives of individual soldiers, and I'm looking at a database of 1,100 soldiers who were confined to the St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the first federal mental institution in the United States. And I'm trying to look at not just what the treatment was and diagnosis, but as I got into their stories, I became much more interested on what happened to them after the war. So the experience of war was really something that men could go back to their communities, could cogitate, it had its greatest impact, I think, in the post-war era. And that's what I'm sifting through now.
Where is St. Elizabeth's Hospital, or where was it?
It's interesting because it was right across the river from the White House at one point, according to eyewitnesses. Lincoln pointed to it and warned Mary Lincoln that if she didn't get a grip on her grief, he would have to send her there. And it was just opened in 1855. Ironically, I'm not working on some of the most interesting aspects that other scholars are, such as the fact that members of Congress could put their raucous family members, including wives that they felt were giving them trouble, they could get locked away in St. Elizabeth's. But it's also true that it opened in 1855, and within 6 years, they became flooded with soldiers. They came from all over the Union because commanders didn't know what to do with the outbreak of malingering, it was called in some cases, the hypos, the blues. So interesting, of course, because Abraham Lincoln has recently been rediscovered as someone who suffered from depression, who had moods. How did he manage during the Civil War? What were his motives? What were his medications? What were his diagnoses? And working on the Lincoln family and Mary Lincoln also got me interested in this particular
Yeah.
project. And medical history, back to that issue, is really booming now. One of my closest friends and my co-editor on the History in the Headline series, which you referred to,
Right.
our first book came out on Confederate statues and memorialization, and that appeared in 2019 based on a roundtable in 2017. So imagine, what it's like in 2021 to look back on this discussion. We're going to have an update. But in 2019, we looked at the landscape and said, I think we need to do a book about voting. And so imagine how grateful we were that Stacey Abram was willing to join our roundtable in our discussion when we recorded in 2019 a book on voter suppression. And that appeared in the summer of 2020, very timely. We're hoping to do another book, but my colleague, meanwhile, was doing all these wonderful books while he was trying to finish his large project, which is coming out now, called Maladies of Empire. And he's dealing with smallpox, fevers, diagnoses in the 17th and 18th century, working on a topic about a pandemic. And, it's so interesting to where medical issues, psychological issues, we're very, very interested in what the impact of COVID will be, for example, on a younger generation. What does confinement do to people? What does, I was able to tell my students in the classroom that they were wondering when their confinement, when their isolation, when could they see family again? And of course, the parallel with what went on during the Civil War struck them very much in the reading.
Yep. Interesting. So interesting. Somebody is asking, why did you focus on Yankee soldiers?
Records, quite clearly, the record base. Plus, I hope anyone can go to my website, www.catherineclinton.com, and see that I have devoted thousands of hours, hundreds of pages to looking at gender and looking at race and looking at Southern voices, Southern lives. But in this particular project, I went to a database and created a database and was able to do that. And I was very interested also because many people aren't aware that World War I was the war in which the majority of Irish fought and died. But the second war in which the Irish fought and died in was the American Civil War. And I found a disproportionate number of Irish immigrants fighting and suffering during the American Civil War. And so my years in Ireland, I think, bled into my interest in my project, because wherever you go, you tend to gather. I mean, I'm just having such a difficult time here in Texas because Texas is where the West meets the South. That's their slogan. But I'm in East Texas, or am I, in San Antonio. I'm certainly in a Patria Chica that I love. And I am finding a lot of interesting similarities. And my students are all working on exciting topics about Confederate widows, Tejanos in the Civil War. My wonderful colleague, Patrick Kelly, is working on the border and the war. My colleague, Omar Valeria Jimenez, is working on the border and the war, the Civil War, and all these issues. And exciting for me is these new scholars incorporate race and gender into their work. We're in the 21st century. So I would say I'm working on those Yankee men because they deserve my attention and looking at gender issues as much as any other group. They fought, they died. Many of them committed themselves to a very long haul for emancipation. And I think the consequences of that are something that our country benefited from and still does.
I cannot wait to read that book either. Catherine, we have one more question, and this is I think a hopeful question, but it reminds me of something I asked you the other day about the current state of scholarship in history and higher ed. And for young people, is it a good field to go into? Can you get jobs anymore?
Oh, I think that what is so interesting is there has been a big shift over the past couple of decades into the realm of public history. You know, earlier you were saying, where can I go and get history? Where can I go? And I find that many of our MAs in our program do not all go into PhD programs. Many of them go into local history museums. We have a project of placing interns into museums or on plantation sites, or because we're doing it remotely now, we have a wonderful opportunity to do that. They're also going into civil service because the history of a city, a state, is budding, and it's something that people are very interested in, and they're interested in the new tools of the digital age. Can you count? Can you look at these questions? So for example, 10 years ago, we had a requirement in our program for comparative history. You couldn't just do American, you had to compare America to Europe. Transnational history is still wonderful, important, but now you also need to learn to use those digital tools, and you need to translate it and bring the community in. One of my students, I was arguing with her because she was saying that the new digital age was perfect for the community. And I said, well, if you have computers, et cetera, but it is a way of preserving these voices, sharing these voices, getting the word out. And so we are teaching our students, it's not your grandmother's history anymore. You know, we're learning all sorts of new things.
There were some holes in all that.
Except remember, it's their podcasts, their vlogs, there are ways in which these stories are going out there. And I think it's really quite intense and interesting. The hunger for history over the past presidencies, which was historic, and the presidency before that, which was historic. I remember being in Dublin the day that Obama was elected and watching the city explode. You know, there is an interesting historical advent going on. And I think people want to know how we got here. How did we get here?
Well, I encourage our youngest viewers to go out and do it and become historians. I love the idea myself. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to meet you and work with you. And I encourage everybody to get this wonderful book. Great work.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes, please do. And thank you so much to Joy Pope, Interim Director of the AJC Decatur Book Festival, for being our moderator this evening. It was a delight to have you. And Catherine, it was an absolute thrill to have you as well. And I hope that when the new book comes out, you will make Metro Atlanta and Gwinnett County Public Library an in-person stop. We would be honored to have you. And Joy, you can come out and moderate in person.
I'll look forward to it. I'll have some more questions.
Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks.